Aye.
Rockwell,
No.
Negrino,
Aye, right? Aye.
Yes, vote aye to support the motion to deny.
Kranzer,
Aye.
Gisselman.
Absent.
Oh, sorry. Forney
Aye.
and Bender.
Aye.
So it's 5-1.
And that motion carries. Next, we have the site plan review. Would someone like to start us off with a motion on that? Commissioner Bender?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll move to deny the site plan review. I think the first item sort of makes the second item.
Right. The site plan, of course, is based on the approval of that expansion. Is there a second? Further discussion? Seeing none, clerk, please call the roll.
Bender.
Aye.
Forney.
Aye.
Kranzer.
Aye.
Negrino.
Aye.
Rockwell.
Aye.
Slack.
Aye.
6-0.
And that motion carries. That concludes our discussion on item number 5. Our next item for discussion is item 9, which is a zoning code text amendment related to emergency and overnight shelters. And Ms. Sether is staff.
Commissioners, staff is here to present the overnight shelter zoning code text amendment. So what's presently on our zoning code books today is that in order to open a new overnight shelter, you have got to be one of two things. One is accessory to, so that's subordinate in area and use and intensity to a religious institution or place of assembly, or be located in the downtown shelter overlay district. So staff set off with the direction of our co-authors, Councilmember Bender and Councilmember Gordon, looking at what the City of Minneapolis can do to improve our available options to provide additional overnight shelters. I have a few slides here with some statistics from Heading Home, or the Office of Ending Homelessness and Heading Home Hennepin. So we have tracked the usage of emergency and overnight shelters through Hennepin County. And the last unsheltered count, for example, was 207, and that was June of this year. Here is a map identifying all of the facilities that Hennepin County assists with funding to provide overnight shelter beds. You'll see many of these uses are not defined in the zoning code as an overnight shelter, either principal or accessory. We have board and care, one board and care facility. We have community residential facilities. Those are our youth shelters because they carry a Department of Health and Human Services license. The Drake Hotel takes in families and individuals. We also have the accessory and principal as shown here. And then several of our family shelters, including Mary's Place and People Serving People, are actually supportive housing uses that also provide additional beds, but the principal use in those circumstances are supportive housing. So this amendment is specifically around being a principal use. Here are some additional graphs that show the number of families in Hennepin County that are in shelter, and all of the shelters you see listed here are located within Minneapolis. Here are our single adults in Hennepin County, and this again was with the permission of the Office of Home at Hennepin. And the total people in shelter. So you'll see that there's a peak in October of 2013 of just over 2,500, and then the last count was just under 2,000 in June. Here's a Wilder study showing some demographic information about who are our homeless population, how many fit within those specific demographics. We shared much of this information with the Committee of the Whole and at our community meetings. So that kind of brings me to our recap of the public outreach. So we formed a steering committee early in the process. So back in April, we met for the first time, March. We had 3 overnight shelter steering committee meetings. It was mostly operators of shelters, nonprofit organizations, with the goal of ending homelessness. And then the Office for Ending Homelessness was also there. We discussed the need for flexibility in the ordinance, providing additional locations that could be affordable. These are not uses that are typically able to create a lot of additional funds. So we need to find property that's also near transit and has good access to service. We did identify that right now there's a smaller need that's not being met for buildings that provide maybe fewer beds. We followed up in the middle of the process with a homeless shelter forum where several of us in our office, including the council office, met with homeless individuals to talk about existing conditions, talking about the importance of access to transit and access to other services, and creating a dignified space. And then we followed up with 3 community meetings. The first 2 was to really gauge from the public what are some of the issues that we would like to mitigate through specific development standards. And then the 3rd meeting that we had in September was specifically around the text itself. So for the proposed text amendment, we identified the need to really split out into 2 different categories. One is to create a new classification for emergency shelter. The intent is really to have a smaller shelter that would mirror the occupancy for a community residential facility in those districts, but would require a conditional use permit. So here is a map that shows all of the available land that would be appropriately zoned to allow for an emergency shelter. The stratification that you see is on occupancy. So the lightest blue color would allow up to 6 persons, kind of that medium blue is up to 16, and the darkest would be up to 32 persons. With the proposed text amendment, staff is also proposing a spacing requirement of 1,000 feet to avoid concentration. So you'll see that is applied to this map as well. So the existing accessory and principal overnight shelters have that concentric circle around it. And then those parcels within that area have been eliminated. The second type would be an overnight shelter as a principal use. So right now, as I mentioned, we only allow for overnight shelters in the downtown shelter overlay district. So here's a map showing the eligible area kind of highlighted in orange. And then we have 1 property that's within that DS overlay that is actually zoned appropriately. So we have 1 principal overnight shelter within the city of Minneapolis. This proposed text amendment would allow, with a conditional use permit, a new overnight shelter up to 150 people in the C2, C4, downtown, and industrial living overlay districts. Now, the only caveat to that maximum of 150 persons is if the building code requires not that many people, it's whichever is less. So, of course, to meet health and safety standards by our building code would supersede that then, of course, whichever is less. Here's a map in green showing some of our areas that would be added to the eligible areas to open a new overnight shelter. So a few of our corridors have been opened up: Central Avenue, Lake Street, the Hiawatha corridor, downtown, of course. That's where predominantly we see the additional areas that would allow. There are some scattered green in all of the wards. So that would allow for an overnight shelter to theoretically be open in any one of our city's wards. And then lastly, overnight shelters that are accessory and currently accessory to a religious institution or place of assembly. Staff did not want to make those uses non-conforming. Therefore, we retained that in the zoning ordinance and we added additional language. And again, here is where they're located. Sorry, let me go a little bit further. There we are at the very bottom. That any of those existing overnight shelters that on the date of approval, and this assumes that we would go forward on December 11th, but that could of course change based on once the council recognizes it, that those that are currently accessory to a religious institution, if that church or mosque or synagogue were to close, that they would be allowed to continue on at their current occupancy without needing to come back to seek additional approvals. And we would allow for a conditional use permit to be applied for if additional shelter beds were to be requested. The off-street parking requirement, as proposed, we would expect 0. We didn't want to necessarily require a lot of parking, especially in our low-density districts, where we would be solving one problem to only create another problem, where off-street parking is not necessarily easy to provide on your standard 40-foot lot, for example. The maximum would be 1 space per bed. And for overnight shelters, we would determine the parking requirement based on the conditional use permit. And we do that for similar large congregate living facilities where we really need to understand more of the operations of that specific operator, how many staff will be present, how many beds, who is the intended demographic potentially. So we would evaluate that as part of the conditional use permit, and then that would be presented to the City Planning Commission. I think there was one more thing I wanted to add, but it's not coming to mind, so I would take any questions at this point.
Okay, commissioners, are there any questions of staff? Commissioner Cron.
Thank you, Shannon. I have a couple of general questions and a couple of questions on spacing.
Sure.
So, both of the emergency shelter and overnight shelters would be conditional use permits. Do we know yet what the conditions of approval would be for those CUPs?
So what we have right now are proposed specific development standards for each use, and they're almost identical. The only difference between the two is addressing that maximum occupancy. For emergency shelters, in the proposed text, we actually put it right into the use table. So if you're zoned R1 through R2B, it's an emergency shelter serving 6 persons or less. So that's why it's not a specific development standard. But what we would be looking for is spacing, of course. Occupancy would only be for overnight shelters. We'd be looking for compatibility with new additions or proposed new construction with the surrounding area. Appropriate transition area, which we would handle typically through site plan review. But if site plan review is not triggered, and instead we only have a conditional use permit because perhaps they're occupying an existing building, we have that additional provision to make sure that the use is compatible with adjacent property. The shelter guests be provided an enclosed waiting area or be serviced by appointment, or unless the shelter's open 24 hours a day. A management plan, and many of the existing operators currently, when they know they're going to come forward, they take that management plan to the neighborhood associations and really work through a lot of the details to make sure that everybody's on the same page. At one of our community meetings, one of the representatives from the Jordan Area Community Council talked about how important that was for everyone in the community that was involved in the neighborhood at the meeting that day, and the operators to kind of understand how it works. And then they also followed up with a site visit, and then the additional provision for checking for litter, both on and off the property within 100 feet. So that would be primarily what we're looking for. Additional conditions could be around traffic congestion, size of the enclosed waiting area. Those are some additional ones where we may consider.
Okay, and then you've mentioned the management plan, but is there any licensing or additional inspections required?
Thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to add. So the zoning code does not, well done. The zoning code cannot cover all bases. So so Councilmember Gordon introduced a text amendment that, through our colleagues in the Department of Health, require a lodging or a board and lodge license for facilities. And they're still working through the specific parameters of the licensing component, but it's set to approve on the same schedule. If this zoning code amendment goes forward, they would go to the same city council meeting for consideration as a whole package.
Okay. And how does, I understand how a facility attached to a religious institution would kind of operate and get funding. And how would a nonprofit or someone who's not associated with a religious institution get one of these up and running from a funding perspective?
Sure. What we found, and we have some operators that are here, they can tell you, is many of them are actually not affiliated with the religious institution directly. They actually are a separate entity, and they operate the business that they know how, which is shelters. And so they're, although tied by location, and maybe historically were tied due to philanthropic goals of that religious institution, they have now, many of them no longer are the same entity. And so I can let the operator speak a little bit more.
Yeah, that'd be great to understand. So
Sure.
with everything, there's money for capital, and there's money for operation and maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
In most lines of work, capital money is easy to get, and maintenance and operations is more difficult. So I'd kind of like to understand that. I mean, I'm kind of reacting to a place I go by past, and forgive me for not knowing who operates it, but at 28th and it's either First or Stevens, there's a I think it's a church and some auxiliary buildings that have been under stucco repair for a long time, and it's like these things have an impact on the neighborhood and the community, as you I'm sure well aware. So just wanting to make sure that at least it's understood how these things are come to be and how they can be maintained properly.
I don't believe we have anyone here from Hennepin County, unless I'm wrong, but we have additional information around funding that is not necessarily specific to the zoning code text amendment, but we understand ongoing maintenance is our best effort to ensure that the compatibility with building additions and existing construction are through these specific development standards. So that would be applicable with the conditional
and
use.
there's basic city standards that every building has to comply to, peeling paint, things like that. Moving on to the spacing questions I have.
Mm-hmm.
So other supportive housing proposals that we have seen recently use the American with Disabilities Act to waive the spacing requirement.
Yes.
Is that something we might see with these uses?
It is possible, however, not necessarily likely. Many of the uses where we've seen individuals seek reasonable accommodation through the Federal Fair Housing Amendments Act is because they have a defined demographic that meets the definition of disability per the Act. And in this case, many of our operators do not necessarily provide services to a specific demographic, or the demographic may change over time. So it's possible, for example, homeless veterans may qualify for reasonable accommodation. We have not had that request made of us before, but notwithstanding the amendment, I believe that's something that someone could apply for reasonable accommodation now if that was the case.
And I believe, given a good attorney, anyone can be classified as a the terms of the class, a protected class. I think there's broad interpretation of protected class, but that's okay. So my other question is, you mentioned you did look at other spacing dimensions,
Yes.
distances. Could you go quickly through that?
Sure.
That's really my last question.
So I apologize because the colors changed, but I did it for readability, and then I wasn't able to update it in time for the Planning Commission this afternoon. It was something that we just used internally. Okay, so in this example of the map, we have red for emergency shelters, yellow for overnight shelters, but anywhere you see yellow, red would also be allowed, okay? So if you can imagine, just watch the concentric circles around those uses. So this would be the 1,000-foot spacing, and this is quarter mile, and then we have half mile. So the effective difference between the 1,000-foot and the quarter mile spacing is 350 feet, or just under 1,250, something in that ballpark. So it's pretty negligible. Staff identified the 1,000-foot dimension because that's currently what we require for the downtown shelter overlay as one of the conditions for a new shelter. So we started with 1,000 feet. We thought it doesn't change the map significantly by requiring that additional spacing requirement. And seeing as how, right, it's essentially to allow more of these uses. And because there were not that many opportunities for the overnight shelter anyway, we thought the lesser spacing was appropriate.
You don't have the map you just did with
Sure, yes.
with the occupancy maximums map.
I do not, but I don't think I can do them necessarily side by side. If you can imagine where you see the yellow, though, the yellow is most likely where you're going to see the darker, plus quite a few areas along our corridor. So I'll try to just bring them up and see if I can do something as close to side by side as possible.
Yeah. And Commissioner Kronzer, I might suggest if we have more questions, maybe it'd be a good idea to just take some testimony first, since
I don't know if that's
sat
helpful.
around for an hour and a half now. So in that case, I'll open the public hearing right now, and Shanna, maybe we'll have some more questions for you in a moment. Is there anyone who would like to speak on this item? Yes, please come forward and state your name and address for the record. You can decide.
Thank you. Mr. President, Commissioners, thank you for your time this evening. My name is Steve Horsfield. I'm the Executive Director of Simpson Housing Services. We operate a shelter at 2740 First Avenue South. What you see on the outside of the building is unfortunately a problem with our landlord, if you will. There are some financial struggles within the Methodist Church from which we lease that space. And to the point that was made earlier about financing, just to give you a little bit of an insight, it's not easy work to get into, quote unquote, given that our operating expenses for that shelter for 66 people each evening is running close to about $1 million a year at this point, more than half of which is raised through private contributions from the public. So as a nonprofit, we are owned by the public and are held to a certain accountability in all sorts of ways, through our board and through the way that we raise our funds and so forth. And in this particular case, this is not easy money to raise, if you will, for emergency shelter. I am here to speak in support of the proposed text amendment. Shelters are a critical resource in the continuum of services that lead Minneapolis residents back to housing stability. The South Minneapolis shelter that we operate has been a safe place for 66 members of our community, been operating for more than 30 years. And it also gives hundreds of volunteers an opportunity to engage around this issue each year. We are deeply appreciative of the work that's been done on this proposal, in that it creates new capacity for purpose-designed shelters in commercial zoning districts, and that it creates opportunities created for smaller residential-based facilities in mixed-use areas, and for the elimination of the requirement that shelters are only allowed as an accessory use as a place of worship. And as I am here representing an agency that is only one of a handful of established shelter providers in Minneapolis, I can tell you that our primary interest is not in opening more shelters. That we would only pursue the development of new programs where there's community support and where we think we can do so in a better way in terms of more dignity for our guests and improved permanent housing outcomes. That's the only way in which we'd be interested. Wherever possible, we are allocating all of our resources in permanent solutions to homelessness. And just to give you a little bit of idea of the scale, we've got 66 people in a shelter each night. We've got 400 households scattered around the metro of people who are formerly homeless that we're supporting, because that's where our focus is. One recommendation I'd just like to quickly leave with the committee as you proceed with this work and with broader city planning. There are two established shelters represented here this evening, Simpson and St. Stephen's, that have been operating successfully in South Minneapolis. As these programs serve 50 to 70 people each, respectively, and they're cited in R2B zoning districts, which I know is a particularly problematic district given the way that it is cited in different chunks around the city. They actually would not be permitted as a primary use if they were to apply for a new application now, and that's something to consider as these are the operations that we know how to run and that are running in the city well, and that's something that we should consider in the future. So thank you for your consideration and your important work on this issue.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? Yes, go ahead and please state your name and address for the record.
My name is Randall Cone. I am a resident of the Whittier neighborhood at 22nd block on Harriet Avenue, where my wife and I have rented the bottom floor of a duplex since we moved to Minneapolis in 2009. I'm now an attorney in Minneapolis, but most of the time that I've been here, I worked in homeless services as a shelter advocate, outreach worker, case manager, and ultimately as a program supervisor. So I speak to you today, therefore, with equal urgency from both of those roles as a resident of, I think, a contested neighborhood who wants to protect the vitality and diversity of that neighborhood, and also as an advocate concerned for the well-being of the poorest and most vulnerable members of our community. First, as a resident of the Whittier neighborhood, I moved to that neighborhood when I got to Minneapolis, in part because I appreciate its authentic diversity. And when I say diversity, I mean in part the internationalism that it so proudly declares on all of its signs, but I also mean real economic diversity. I quickly became proud of my community for the historic commitment of the churches in the neighborhood to providing practical, direct services to help mitigate the impacts of the homelessness crisis, and of those churches and the service organizations that grew out of that work for sticking it out and finding ways to stay open, even as the churches that hosted the shelters and the congregations that attended them faced deterioration. Let me be clear, I am proud of the shelters in my neighborhood. They symbolize to me what it looks like to put the progressive values and care for others that many in this city like to claim into practice. And they stand for a recognition that the people who seek shelter are not intruders into our community or a threat to it, but rather are some of the most vulnerable members of our community. I support this amendment because it will affirm that historic commitment in my neighborhood and will make it more likely that other neighborhoods in Minneapolis whose residents share Whittier's values will be able to provide similar services. As a homeless service worker and advocate, I will add the following. The work that shelters do is hard. Shelters that provide emergency services have to hustle to stay open. They never have enough resources. They must be flexible and responsive. And even as they literally work to help members of our community survive the winter, they must also constantly fight to justify their existence to people who see them as threats to property value and development projects. The current zoning rules make it that much harder, tying up one hand of advocacy organizations and forcing them to perform a charade of association with religious organizations in some cases, some of which largely continue to exist as religious organizations only in order to allow the shelters to continue to exist. What this amendment would allow, in effect, is for the organizations that are already taking on the burden of providing life-saving emergency support to our city's most vulnerable populations to do so in good faith, and with both hands in facilities that are safe, efficient, and appropriate to their purpose, and they're better able to allow the people who benefit from those services to do so with dignity. Finally, I want to briefly address some of the concerns that I've heard articulated by organizations purporting to represent the interests of my neighborhood, specifically that it will contribute to an increased density of low-income housing in particular neighborhoods, an argument that is offered with a straight face in the name of addressing systemic housing inequity in our city. These arguments are pretextual and make the dubious move of attempting to reframe what is simple, cynical NIMBYism as concerns in the interest of justice and equity. There is enough obfuscation in the language that our city uses to talk about its efforts to address the needs of its poorest people. There is enough empty boosterism about our supposedly progressive efforts to end the crisis of homelessness that often provides little more than a smokescreen for measures designed to remove visible poverty from commercially developed and developing parts of the city. I ask, in light of all of this, for simple candor in your deliberations. This amendment will remove an arbitrary, antiquated, and very possibly illegal barrier to those doing essential humanitarian work in our cities. While we continue the very important and difficult work of addressing structural inequity in housing and other areas, there continues to be a crisis on the streets every day, and that crisis needs to be managed. This amendment is not about how we will solve the bigger problems. It is about how we manage the crisis. Please don't make saving lives every day any harder than it has to be. Thank you, Council Members Bender and Gordon, for your leadership.
All right, thank you. Next speaker. Go ahead. And please state your name and address for the record.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Gail Dorfman, the Executive Director of St. Stephen's Human Services. We operate 2 shelters, our main shelter in the rectory of St. Stephen's Church that shelters 45 men every night of the year, and our emergency winter shelter that just opened last night at the River of Life Church on the north side. I want to thank Council Members Bender and Gordon for bringing a shelter zoning amendment forward, and to city staff, particularly Shanna, for all the work done on this together with both shelter providers and with the community, and to the Planning Commission for your consideration. In Heading Home Hennepin, our city-county 10-year plan to end homelessness, we state that the best way to end homelessness is to prevent it in the first place. But when someone does become homeless, that systems will be in place to get people off the streets and out of shelter as quickly as possible and into safe and stable housing. Shelter is not housing. We're really, really clear about that in our 10-year plan, but is often a critical stop on the way to housing. Last night in Hennepin County, similar numbers to what Shannon reported. But just last night, there were 298 families with 850 children in shelter. There were 695 single adult men, 162 single women. We've seen that number creep up, 68 teens. The last unsheltered count in July found just under about 200 people unsheltered outside. And the Salvation Army on Curry Avenue is now limiting their overflow space, meaning that somewhere between an additional 30 to 70 men and women could find themselves with nowhere to go at 10 o'clock each night when Salvation Army reaches capacity. We need safe, dignified shelter spaces where people can get out of the cold and move quickly toward housing. This text amendment moves in the right direction toward meeting this need. It does not mean that there will be homeless shelters all over town. That's the last thing any of us want or need, and the text amendment and the accompanying licensing provision guard against that. But it does provide the flexibility to develop a different kind of shelter than ones allowed today, only accessory to religious institutions in the basement of a church, as ours is, with no ADA access in the case of ours. It allows for smaller shelters serving specific populations like GLBT youth, who have almost nowhere to go now, single adult women, seniors, people with disabilities. And it allows for a shelter as a principal use in a commercial district on a transit corridor, improving access to jobs, housing, and services. Ending homelessness means fewer people will become homeless, and when they do, we'll have the emergency shelters and overnight shelters in place to ensure that homelessness will be rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. I urge you to support this shelter zoning